I want to start off by saying in this series, we are going to be talking about some sensitive topics. And if any of these topics would maybe trigger you, such as SA, CA, I guess you would call it. I'm trying to not end up duping myself here. But in this series, it's going to be sometimes super freaking heavy. So just know that. March 26, 1997. Rancho Santa Fe, California. Authorities enter a mansion in a gated community. The air is heavy. The blinds are drawn. Inside, 39 bodies lie perfectly still, neatly arranged on bunk beds. Faces covered with purple shrouds. Each person is dressed the same. Black clothing, Nike Decade sneakers, and a patch reading Heaven's Gate Away Team. No blood, no violence, and no chaos. Just silence. And a final message left behind. Quote, "We are happily exiting this world to board the spacecraft trailing the Hale-Bopp Comet." This wasn't a last-minute suicide pact. It wasn't desperation or fear. This was planned and deliberate. They didn't call it death. They called it graduation.
Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate cult.
Heaven's Gate.
Heaven's Gate.
The Heaven's Gate cult.
Of the Heaven's Gate.
Heaven's Gate.
Heaven's Gate.
Heaven's Gate.
Who was this leader?
Marshall Applewhite.
Marshall Applewhite.
Marshall Applewhite, also known as Doe.
Heaven's Gate begins with two people, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. Applewhite was a former music professor from Texas, charismatic, well-spoken, but troubled in the early 1970s. He was dismissed from a teaching job after a scandal involving a male student. The fallout left him drifting, personally and spiritually lost. Nettles was a nurse, a mother, and a student of astrology and metaphysical teachings. She believed she received messages from spiritual beings, and that her destiny was tied to something far greater than the life she was living. When Applewhite and Nettles met, possibly during a hospital stay, it was instant chemistry. Not romantic, but cosmic. They became convinced that they were chosen, that their meeting had been foretold. They called themselves the Two, after a passage in the book of Revelation. They claimed to be extraterrestrial beings in borrowed human bodies, sent to Earth to prepare a small group of souls for the next level, a higher evolutionary plane beyond Earth. In 1975, they told followers that they would be physically taken to this level by an alien spacecraft. They believed salvation required shedding human attachments, possessions, families, and diaries. The soul had to be purified. The body was just a container, and Earth, it was doomed to be recycled.
This is the 29th of September, 1996. I'm Doe. Doe probably doesn't mean anything to many of you. Our reason for speaking to you is because we feel urgently to warn you of what we are about to say. You know, to try to just put it as briefly as I can put it and as clearly as I can put it, this planet is about to be recycled.
From the mid 1970s through the early 1980s, the group transformed from a loose spiritual movement into a disciplined, cloistered community. Applewhite and Nettles, now going by Do and T or Ty, began calling their group a classroom. Recruits were students, and every moment of their lives became a lesson in leaving behind the human world. Members were told to abandon all earthly ties. They were assigned new names. Contact with families was discouraged, eventually cut off completely. Romantic relationships were forbidden. Even emotional attachments with the group were seen as distractions. That's weird. But like, how you're going to cut them off from these people and then they're going to be with you, but then they can't even really be with you. They're still a singular person and they're not allowed to have any emotional tie with any. That seems very lonely. They lived communally, first in tents and cars, then in rented houses. Everything was done in unison, eating, cleaning, and speaking. It was all carefully regulated. The idea was to become identical, pure, and detached. They followed a detailed rule book, down to how to brush their teeth and fold their clothes. Every aspect of their day was a drill. The goal was to erase the self, to become a vessel for higher transformation. Individuality was seen as weakness. Preference was discouraged. Even facial expressions were studied. Neutrality was the ideal. By the early 1980s, some members had been in the group for nearly a decade, fully believing they were being prepared to physically board a spacecraft that would carry them to another realm. And then, in 1985, Nettles, T, died of cancer. Applewhite recalibrated the doctrine. He said T's vehicle had been left behind, but her essence has gone on. Her death became a kind of promotion. From that moment on, the teachings darkened. The group's focus shifted from physical ascension to the idea that death was a necessary step to reach the next level. Now, the only way out was to exit. In the early 1990s, most assumed Heaven's Gate had vanished, but they had simply adopted, becoming quieter, more tech-savvy, and more obsessed. The group now operated out of a house in San Diego. They created a web design business called Higher Source, and they were good at it. Professional, polite, and efficient. Their clients rarely had any idea they were working with a cult, but behind the scenes, their beliefs had hardened. Applewhite began producing hours of video sermons, long monologues delivered in a flat, hypnotic cadence. He spoke of the earth being recycled, of the human race being corrupted by Luciferians, and of the imminent arrival of a spaceship to collect the chosen. They monitored UFO forums and conspiracy websites. They became obsessed with Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM, a late-night radio show featuring paranormal topics. They believed the internet itself was a tool gifted by higher beings to spread their message. Their doctrine now included alien races, government cover-ups, and the belief that Earth was a sort of soul farm. Humanity, they believed, had been corrupted beyond saving. They still weren't violent. They didn't preach hatred or try to convert through fear, but they believed with total certainty that their time on Earth was almost up. In 1995, astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet. It would become one of the brightest comets in modern history, visible to the naked eye for over a year. Around the same time, rumors began to circulate, mostly online, that a mysterious object was trailing behind the comet. Some said it was a spaceship, others dismissed it as a hoax. To Applewhite, it was a prophecy fulfilled. He declared it a final sign. The spacecraft they had been waiting for was finally here, riding the tail of Hale-Bopp. But to reach it, they would need to shed their earthly vessels. The plan was set into motion. The group began preparations in secret. They updated their website with final messages and created farewell videos. They bought matching black outfits and Nike Decade sneakers. Each member sewed on a patch. Heaven's Gate, away team. The exit was planned with military precision. Over 3 days, in March 1997, the group died in shifts. 15 members at a time consumed a lethal dose of phenobarbital, mixed with vodka, then secured plastic bags over their heads. Those who remained would clean up, position the bodies, and cover them with shrouds. Then they joined the next wave. Applewhite died near the end. He was found in the same uniform as the others, laid out neatly on a bed. All 39 members were calm, clean, and peaceful. There were no signs of a struggle and no violence, just quiet obedience. They believed they had finally reached the gate. The media explosion was immediate. Footage of the scene, the bunk beds, the sneakers, the purple cloths was broadcast around the world. Commentators called it bizarre, terrifying, and incomprehensible. Comedians joked. Nike pulled the decades from shelves, and the public reaction wavered between morbid fascination and ridicule. But cult experts were surprised. They saw Heaven's Gate not as a wild outlier, but as a slow-motion tragedy. A group that had spent over 20 years methodically detaching from the world until death was simply the final step. There was no evidence, no external pressure, just a closed belief system and absolute trust in a single leader. The group's website still exists today, heavensgate.com, maintained by 2 members who stayed behind to continue spreading the message. It looks exactly as it did in 1997. For families of the dead, there was no closure. Some had not seen their loved ones in decades. Others had tried and failed to bring them home. All they received were cremated remains and memories filtered through goodbye videos. No memorial, no graves, just ashes and silence. To most, Heaven's Gate is remembered as a monolith, 39 nameless faces beneath purple shrouds, but each of them had a story. Some were former engineers, nurses, or military veterans. One had been a rancher. Another had once been a mother of 5. Many were educated. Some had college degrees. Several left behind comfortable lives and families. Erica Ernst, for example, was a bright, spirited woman who had worked as a legal secretary. Her sister described her as witty and full of curiosity. David Moore had been an actor and had small roles in films before joining the group. Sawyer, a former member who left before the mass suicide, later said the members were some of the kindest and most thoughtful people he had ever met. They weren't brainless or weak. Most joined voluntarily, often after long periods of spiritual searching or dissatisfaction with modern life. Some members had been with the group for over 20 years, long enough to consider it a family. Others had only joined a few months before the end, drawn in by the group's website or the promise of cosmic purpose. In their farewell videos, recorded just days before their deaths, many smiled and some laughed. They looked calm, even joyful. They didn't seem brainwashed, they seemed convinced. They believed they were graduating from a flawed world into a better one. In the weeks following the mass suicide, Heaven's Gate became late-night fodder. Comedians cracked jokes about Comet riders and Nike cults. SNL aired skits, talk shows mocked the matching outfits. Nike's decades became a grim cultural symbol. Black market prices surged online, even as Nike tried to distance itself. The company quickly discontinued the model. Media saturation was relentless. Photos of the bodies circulated widely. The phrase cult suicide was repeated so often that it became background noise. But not everyone laughed. Scholars and former cult members criticized the way the media handled the tragedy. Some asked, why were the Heaven's Gates deaths treated as a punchline, while other mass deaths, like Jonestown, were met with solemn reflection? The public reaction reflected a discomfort with the idea that these were fringe lunatics. These were people who held steady jobs, paid taxes, and used the internet and lived in suburban homes. They weren't monsters, they were believers. And that may be why the jokes hit so hard. Because beneath the purple cloths and the comet talk, the story wasn't really that alien at all. Heaven's Gate didn't burn itself down. It didn't go out in gunfire. It didn't rage against the world. It simply existed. Calmly, deliberately, as if stepping through a doorway. They didn't believe they were dying. They believed they were graduating. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not the doctrine, not the outfits, but the conviction. As far as the reflection side of these things is, it's like there's a belief, there's blind following, there is a sense of the where people can understand where it's like, how do you not know that it's a cult? In episode 11, we will be diving deep into the psychology of cult leaders and cult followers. So stay tuned for that. Again, never been one to put somebody down for their beliefs or even how they're thinking and how they get brought into that system in the first place, because that's not my place. I'm not a psychologist. That being said, all sources will be down in the description and coming up in the credits after this. Thank you for watching.